The war launched by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in February 2022 did not emerge from miscalculation alone, nor from a sudden ideological rupture. It was the outcome of long-accumulated structural pressures within Russia's security architecture, its post-Cold War position in Europe, and the governing logic of a regime that had increasingly substituted coercion for adaptability. The initial invasion plan reflected a system optimized for short, decisive action under centralized control. Its failure exposed deeper constraints that transformed a war of rapid regime coercion into a prolonged, attritional conflict from which Moscow now struggles to disengage. At its core, the conflict is a manifestation of unresolved post-Soviet power arrangements. The collapse of the Soviet Union created a security vacuum along Russia's western periphery without establishing a mutually accepted European security order. NATO's expansion, Ukraine's oscillation between Russian influence and Western integration, and the absence of binding limits on military posture produced a persistent strategic ambiguity. For Moscow, Ukraine occupied a unique position, not merely a neighboring state, but a critical buffer, an industrial and military legacy space, and a symbolic hinge between Russian great power identity and post-imperial decline. The failure to stabilize this relationship after 1991 left Russian strategy relying on episodic coercion, Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, rather than durable institutional settlement. The Russian state that entered the war was a highly centralized presidential system dominated by the executive, with limited autonomous capacity in legislative or judicial institutions. Power flowed through a narrow circle around President Vladimir Putin, mediated by the presidential administration, the Security Council, and the Siloviki, security and intelligence elites drawn from the Federal Security Service, FSB, the military, and the National Guard. This architecture rewarded loyalty, secrecy, and risk minimization in reporting, while penalizing dissent and institutional learning. Over time, it produced strategic rigidity masked as decisiveness. Key decision-makers operated within this constrained system. Vladimir Putin's strategic worldview was shaped by the late Soviet period and the perceived humiliation of the 1990s. He viewed Western expansion as opportunistic rather than defensive, and interpreted Ukrainian sovereignty as contingent and reversible. His decision-making pattern favored personal arbitration over institutional debate, relying on a small set of trusted advisors. Among them were Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of the Security Council, whose threat perception emphasized Western subversion and internal vulnerability; Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defense, whose position depended more on political loyalty than on operational military competence; and Alexander Bortnikov, Director of the FSB, whose organization provided assessments of Ukrainian political fragility that later proved deeply flawed. The Russian General Staff, under Chief Valery Gerasimov, operated within a doctrine that emphasized hybrid operations and escalation control, but was structurally subordinated to political direction. While the military possessed significant conventional capabilities, its force design favored rapid maneuver and intimidation rather than sustained high-intensity warfare against a mobilized adversary. The assumption underpinning the invasion, that Ukrainian resistance would collapse under shock, elite defection, and limited force, reflected intelligence assessments shaped by institutional incentives to confirm presidential expectations. The opening phase of the war aimed at regime coercion rather than territorial conquest. Russian forces advanced rapidly toward Kyiv, seeking to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership and impose a political settlement before Western responses could fully mobilize. This approach minimized the need for mass mobilization at home and preserved the image of Russia as a controlled, escalation-conscious power. When this effort failed, the Russian system faced a structural dilemma. Withdrawal would have signaled regime weakness, undermined elite confidence, and challenged the credibility of coercion as a tool of statecraft. Escalation, however, required resources and institutional adaptations for which the system was poorly prepared. The shift to attritional warfare was not a strategic choice made freely, but a path-dependent outcome of institutional constraint. Russia's political economy, increasingly oriented toward state control and rent distribution, could be repurposed into a war economy, but only at the cost of long-term growth and technological isolation. Sanctions reinforced this trajectory by narrowing external options and increasing dependence on internal coercion and selective foreign partnerships. Militarily, the conflict forced a transition from professional expeditionary forces to partial mobilization, drawing the broader society into a war that had initially been framed as limited and distant. This moment marked a strategic inflection point. The war ceased to be a tool to reshape Ukraine's alignment and became a mechanism for regime preservation. The leadership's survival logic shifted towards sustaining the conflict at an acceptable cost rather than achieving decisive victory. Nuclear signaling, energy leverage, and information control became compensatory instruments to offset conventional limitations. The longer the war persisted, the more deeply Russian institutions were reconfigured around it, reducing the feasibility of reversal. Personalities mattered only insofar as they interacted with these structures. Putin's aversion to visible retreat, Patrushev's expansive threat perceptions, Shoigu's bureaucratic insulation, and Gerasimov's constrained operational latitude collectively reinforced a trajectory toward prolonged conflict. None alone dictated the outcome. Together, embedded in a centralized and inflexible system, they narrowed the range of viable strategic exits. Thus, Russia's entrapment in protracted war is best understood not as a single misjudgment, but as the culmination of structural choices made over decades. A state built to project power quickly and suppress uncertainty found itself unable to absorb failure without escalating commitment. By the time the initial coercive strategy collapsed, the institutional and political costs of disengagement had already become higher than those of continuation. The war's persistence is therefore less a sign of strategic confidence than of systemic inertia under pressure. As Russia's initial war aims collapsed, the conflict entered a second phase defined less by battlefield maneuver than by regime survival under narrowing constraints. The central question confronting the Kremlin was no longer how to coerce Ukraine quickly, but how to preserve internal stability while sustaining a war that had become structurally unavoidable. Power preservation, not victory, emerged as the organizing logic of decision-making. This shift reshaped elite relations, civil-military dynamics, and the economic foundations of the Russian state. Elite cohesion became the first and most immediate pressure point. The Russian political system relies on a tacit bargain among elites: political loyalty in exchange for access to rents, protection, and predictability. War disrupted this equilibrium. Sanctions constrained capital mobility, limited foreign asset protection, and reduced the discretionary space in which oligarchic and bureaucratic elites traditionally operated. Yet fragmentation did not translate into organized opposition. The regime's coercive apparatus, anchored in the Federal Security Service, FSB, the National Guard under Viktor Zolotov, and the Prosecutor General's office, ensured that dissent remained individualized and costly rather than collective and coordinated. President Vladimir Putin managed elite cohesion through selective redistribution and controlled uncertainty. Defense contracts, regional subsidies tied to mobilization performance, and expanded roles for loyal technocrats compensated for losses elsewhere. Figures such as Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin played a stabilizing role, focusing on administrative continuity and macroeconomic management rather than strategic direction. This division of labor allowed Putin to remain the ultimate arbiter while insulating himself from day-to-day crisis management. The result was not elite enthusiasm, but disciplined compliance driven by risk aversion. Civil-military relations underwent a parallel transformation. The Russian armed forces, initially shielded from societal exposure through the use of contract soldiers and deniable formations, were drawn progressively closer to the population through partial mobilization. This created tensions between the Ministry of Defense and other coercive actors. Sergei Shoigu's authority was increasingly contested by informal power centers, including paramilitary formations such as the Wagner Group under Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose public criticism of military leadership reflected deeper institutional rivalry. While these actors operated nominally in support of the war, their emergence signaled stress within the command hierarchy and competition over access to resources and presidential attention. The Kremlin responded by reasserting centralized control. Valery Gerasimov's elevation to direct operational command marked an attempt to restore formal military hierarchy and integrate disparate forces under a unified structure. This move reflected not confidence but necessity. Fragmentation threatened not only battlefield effectiveness but also the regime's monopoly on organized violence. The state tolerated limited dissent from within the pro-war camp only so long as it reinforced escalation rather than questioning the war's legitimacy. When challenges crossed institutional boundaries, they were met with decisive suppression, reaffirming the primacy of regime survival over operational flexibility. Economic pressure constituted the most enduring constraint. Western sanctions targeted finance, technology, energy exports, and logistics, aiming to degrade Russia's long-term war-making capacity. In response, the Kremlin accelerated the transformation of the economy into a war-supporting system. Capital controls, currency management, and expanded state intervention stabilized short-term indicators such as inflation and employment, masking deeper structural erosion. Energy exports were redirected toward Asia, particularly China and India, often at discounted prices that preserved revenue flows while reducing strategic leverage. This economic adaptation carried significant trade-offs. Dependence on a narrower set of trade routes increased vulnerability to external pressure and reduced bargaining power. Technological substitution lagged behind military consumption needs, forcing reliance on stockpiles and foreign intermediaries. The defense industrial complex expanded output, but at the cost of civilian investment and long-term productivity. These choices reflected a prioritization of endurance over efficiency, consistent with a regime preparing for extended confrontation rather than rapid resolution. Internal pressure reshaped Russia's external behavior accordingly. Diplomacy became instrumental rather than reconciliatory, aimed at managing escalation risks and preventing the consolidation of a unified adversarial bloc. Nuclear signaling served as a deterrent backdrop rather than a tool of immediate escalation, designed to freeze Western intervention thresholds while allowing conventional operations to continue. Energy policy shifted from market integration to strategic leverage, even as structural dependence on hydrocarbon revenues constrained Moscow's freedom of action. Leadership decisions under these conditions were marked by conservatism. Putin avoided measures that would fundamentally alter the social contract, such as full mobilization or overt wartime governance, preferring incremental escalation that distributed costs unevenly across society. Patrushev and the Security Council reinforced narratives of existential threat, justifying repression and resource extraction as defensive necessities. Shoigu, despite criticism, remained in place as a symbol of continuity, his political survival tied to loyalty rather than performance. The cumulative effect of these dynamics was a regime increasingly locked into its own survival logic. Options narrowed, not because alternatives disappeared, but because their perceived costs to internal stability outweighed external risks. The war became a mechanism through which elite discipline was enforced, economic structures were reordered, and coercive capacity was normalized. Under such conditions, strategic flexibility diminished. The state adapted to pressure, but adaptation itself generated new dependencies that further constrained choice. In this phase, Russia did not collapse, nor did it consolidate decisive advantage. Instead, it entered a state of managed attrition, internally stabilized yet externally constrained, resilient in the short term but accumulating long-term vulnerabilities. Power was preserved, but at the price of strategic entanglement, setting the conditions for consequences that would extend well beyond the immediate conflict. By the time the war settled into protracted attrition, its strategic significance extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. What began as a coercive intervention evolved into a structural force reshaping Russia's internal governance, Europe's security architecture, and the broader international system. The consequences of this entrapment are not defined by imminent collapse or decisive victory, but by the slow reconfiguration of power under sustained pressure. Militarily, the conflict has altered Russia's force posture and doctrine in ways that are difficult to reverse. The reliance on mass artillery, defensive depth, and incremental territorial gains reflects both adaptation and limitation. While the Russian military has demonstrated an ability to learn tactically, its strategic freedom of action has narrowed. Large-scale offensive maneuver has become costly and politically sensitive, while defensive endurance has emerged as the default mode of operation. This shift locks Russia into a war of consumption, where industrial output, manpower management, and logistics outweigh operational brilliance. Nuclear forces, meanwhile, have assumed a stabilizing yet constraining role. Russia's nuclear arsenal has not been mobilized for use, but for signaling. Strategic ambiguity has been carefully calibrated to deter direct NATO intervention without triggering uncontrolled escalation. This posture reinforces escalation control as a central objective of Russian strategy, even as conventional capabilities are strained. The paradox is that nuclear strength compensates for conventional weakness, but also limits Russia's ability to escalate meaningfully without risking catastrophic outcomes. The result is a frozen escalation ladder, where threats maintain relevance precisely because they are not executed. Internally, the war has accelerated trends toward repression and institutional consolidation. The boundary between internal security and external conflict has blurred, with wartime narratives justifying expanded surveillance, legal repression, and information control. This is not a temporary wartime aberration, but a structural recalibration of governance. The regime increasingly treats societal compliance as a security variable, managed through coercion and selective incentives rather than consent. While this approach enhances short-term stability, it reduces the system's capacity for feedback and correction, increasing the risk of strategic surprise over time. Externally, the war has catalyzed a fundamental shift in Europe's security order. NATO's eastern flank has been reinforced, defense spending has increased across the continent, and military planning has pivoted from expeditionary operations to territorial defense. Russia's actions have resolved ambiguities that long characterized European threat perception. The strategic environment Moscow sought to prevent, one of sustained Western military integration near its borders, has materialized not through negotiation failure alone, but as a consequence of prolonged conflict. At the regional level, the war has constrained Russia's ability to project influence beyond Ukraine. Resources diverted to the conflict have reduced attention and leverage in other theaters, from the South Caucasus to Central Asia. While Moscow retains significant influence through historical ties and security arrangements, its role has become more reactive than directive. This creates openings for other powers, particularly China and regional middle powers, to shape outcomes in ways that may not align fully with Russian interests. Globally, the conflict has contributed to a more fragmented international system. Sanctions regimes, energy realignment, and financial decoupling have accelerated the erosion of post-Cold War economic integration. Russia's adaptation through alternative payment systems, shadow logistics networks, and non-Western trade partnerships illustrates both resilience and constraint. These mechanisms allow survival under pressure, but do not replicate the efficiencies of the prior system. The long-term consequence is a bifurcated global economy characterized by redundancy, higher transaction costs, and politicized trade. Leadership dynamics reinforce these trajectories rather than redirect them. Vladimir Putin remains the central decision-maker, but his strategic environment has become increasingly bounded by the very measures taken to ensure regime survival. The personalization of power reduces succession clarity and concentrates risk, while institutional loyalty replaces strategic debate. Figures such as Patrushev continue to frame the conflict in existential terms, reinforcing a security-first worldview that narrows diplomatic flexibility. Military leadership, operating under political constraint, prioritizes sustainability over innovation. The cumulative effect is a state and regime locked into structural momentum. De-escalation carries high internal political costs, while escalation offers diminishing returns. The war thus persists not because it promises decisive gain, but because it has become embedded in the logic of governance and power preservation. This does not imply permanence. Structural pressures, economic fatigue, demographic strain, and elite recalibration will continue to accumulate. But their impact is likely to be gradual, shaping behavior at the margins rather than producing sudden rupture. For the international system, the most significant outcome is normalization of prolonged, high-intensity conflict between major powers without direct alliance confrontation. The war demonstrates how states can sustain large-scale violence under conditions of economic isolation and strategic constraint, challenging assumptions about deterrence, globalization, and conflict termination. It reinforces a world in which power shifts are incremental, contested, and costly, and where stability is maintained less by consensus than by managed rivalry. In this context, Russia's war is neither an anomaly nor an isolated crisis. It is a case study in how structural entrapment operates under pressure, how states adapt to failure by narrowing choice, how regimes survive by hardening institutions, and how systemic consequences unfold slowly, often invisibly, before they reshape the strategic landscape. The conflict's ultimate significance lies not in its final territorial lines, but in the durable transformations it has already set in motion.